So today in this slideshow, we're going to be talking about methods of development. And methods of development are things that you may be asked to address during your essay interview. Now, I will give you a bunch of names for the different types of methods of development. However, you don't necessarily need to refer to these individually by name. As you will see, they do kind of overlap each other, and sometimes, the name for something or the type of method of development could be used somewhere else. So when we're thinking of methods of development, I find students often confuse them with hooks. So a hook happens at the beginning of the piece and is to draw the reader in. A method of development happens during the piece and is basically expanding upon the argument throughout the piece. Now, there are a bunch of different types of methods of development. So if you're trying to think about the difference between a hook and a method of development, think of a TED Talk. The first, say, minute and a half of a TED Talk would be that hook. That's them trying to draw you in. And then the methods of development occur after that when they're trying to explain and prove their point. And there's lots of different ways that an author or speaker or whatever would do this. So we'll go through all of these individually. And we'll start with illustrations, details, and examples. So when we're looking at these, this is when the kind of thing that you would often do in an essay where you're providing some supporting evidence. So you may be providing, say, an example from your own life in the in-class essay to help prove your point. And you're using it to convince the readers that your point is correct because I've provided this example that helps to prove my point is true. So you're going to see throughout that I've provided you with examples to help show you what these different methods of development look like in actual essays. These were essays I used to read with 4U students, but I don't read them with them anymore because I've kind of moved into a different format of the essay unit as we've discussed before. So this one is from an essay called It's All Real, But It's Not All True by Catherine Bush. And in it, Bush is trying to argue that we shouldn't necessarily believe in the concept of autobiographical fallacy, which basically means that an author is trying to or is writing themselves into their books. So here's the example she uses. Every review of Saul Bellows' novel Ravelstein comments on the fact that his eponymous protagonist bears a striking resemblance to Bellows' late friend, the philosopher Alan Bloom. So she's trying to prove her point that it's not necessarily true and providing an example from a book, namely Ravelstein by Saul Bellows. The next one is called Logos. So you're going to see there's a couple of the methods of development that end with this os. Logos is when you're providing facts, numbers, or information. Now, this would be an individual fact number, like a percentage or something like that, or information. One of the things that I will kind of point out to you here, because it's a problem that I see in a number of essays when I'm reading them, is that often students don't realize that if you're providing a percentage or a date or something like that, that did not come out of your brain. You had to research it, so you need to include an MLA citation for that, even if you're not quoting it. So even if it's not like a quotation that says this person says this percentage or whatever, and you're just using the percentage or using the date, it needs to have that MLA citation because it did not come out of your brain. So this example is just one that I made up. In a recent study, it was determined that 33% of accidents occur because the driver was distracted by an electronic device. So it's a one-off situation where I'm providing this piece of information, and realistically, that percentage is pretty low. It's probably much higher than that. The next one is description. So when you're including description, it's something that's supposed to appeal to the senses. So you're trying to draw someone in, and you know that you probably enjoy good narrative pieces when they do appeal to a number of your senses. Like, I personally really like when they talk about food in books, which makes me sound like someone who's really obsessed with food. But I love when they really describe those taste sensations of food in a book. And it creates an impression. So it's something that really makes you like focus on or think about that one particular thing that the author is trying to describe in detail. So this comes from an essay called Am I Blue by Alice Walker. And in this essay, Walker is sort of telling the story of this horse who loses his mate, and she's making some bigger connections to racism in society. So she's got this description of Blue the horse. Blue was like a crazed person. He galloped furiously as if he were being ridden around and around his 5 beautiful acres. He whinnied until he couldn't. He tore at the ground with his hooves. He butted himself against a single shade tree. So you can hear maybe him whinnying, or him tearing at the ground with his hooves is a very stark description of something. It makes you can really picture him digging his hooves in and pulling that out. So maybe that's a touch or a sight thing for you. So it's really describing it so you can see how upset Blue is when his horse partner is taken away. So in that passage, Walker is talking about how Blue reacted to losing the friend because she wants people to see how animals can teach us, because he's showing this great reaction. And then so we're trying to understand how he felt when he lost his partner. The next one is narration. So I find that this often gets confused by students in their brain with tell a story, because both of them are talking about telling a story. However, tell a story in a hook happens at one point at the beginning of the essay, and it's a quick little story that then is not necessarily referred to again throughout the essay. It's to kind of lead you in. Whereas narration is when the whole essay is kind of surrounding a story that you're telling. So the example that I'm going to give you here, well, there's actually two examples here. So the first one is that Am I Blue that I was just talking about. So the whole essay is actually a story about this horse named Blue. So it's like a continuous narration. And then the other essay I'll talk about is one that I used to read quite a bit, but it is getting a little old and dated. So it's called Do Grades Really Matter? And it's basically talking about how if your grades in high school make a difference, how successful you're going to be in society later on. So there's a longer story here that I'm not going to necessarily read the whole thing, but it's a good example if you want to come back to it. Where these two brothers, Mike and Mark Cowie, weren't great in school. So she starts off by telling their story and then continues to return back to those brothers because although they weren't great in school, they became successful entrepreneurs. So it's helping to prove her point that, you know, if you've got that hustle, it doesn't really matter how you did in school. Then we've got comparison contrast. This is a type of essay that you will be writing, namely for your book club essay. You may choose to do some comparison and contrast in your Hamlet essay as well, but it won't be necessary. So the point of a comparison and contrast is it's highlighting similarities and differences to emphasize a point. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that the purpose of highlighting the similarities and differences is to emphasize that point, and you're not just saying, these things are the same, these things are different. Because if you're just talking about the similarities and differences between two things, then so what, right? I could pick up any two books on the shelf in my classroom and say they're similar in some ways and they're different in others. But the so what is when you get into the meat of your essay. So the example here is from that Jeremy Clarkson essay that I made reference to in our hooks lesson. So he's talking about a dog, and he's basically comparing a dog to a human being. So he's saying you can teach a dog all sorts of things, like where to go to the bathroom, not to drop litter, and that kind of stuff. But would you let a dog drive a car? No, you wouldn't. And then he had made reference earlier about how, you know, people don't use public restrooms properly and people drop litter and things like that. So, you know, if human beings can't even do those simple things, then why would we let them drive a car? Then we've got an analogy. So an analogy is when you take something that's complex and then you compare it to something that's easier to understand so that someone can understand this like bigger thing. Like you may have seen teachers do this in, say, science class, where they take this like complex idea in science class and then try to compare it to something that you connect with more to help it sort of stick in your brain. So in Am I Blue, again, the essay, Alice Walker is creating this comparison between our treatment of animals and our treatment of people of different races to make this like bigger statement. So she's using this analogy of the treatment of this horse to how we treat people of different races. Definition. So when you're using a definition as a method of development, it may be a one-off definition that you include in a paragraph to help prove the point of that paragraph, or it may be an ongoing definition. Like say you want to write your whole essay on Hamlet about proving Hamlet's a tragedy. Well, then you're going to throw that definition in, but then you're going to keep going back to that definition to help prove your point. So an example here is in this essay called Forget Prince Charming, and it's about finding the perfect mate. So in this, she's kind of defining this term called the oceanic feeling by Sigmund Freud. And it's basically that feeling that washes over you when you fall in love with someone and they become, you know, your partner, that you can't see the bad things in them. Which, as I'm saying this, some of you who are in relationships may, you know, be thinking that that's the case that you're in, or that your friends are in that case right now. So it's an important definition for her essay.